Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our session where we're going to debate how we robustly adapt to climate change. Let me start off by introducing myself. My name is Deborah Roberts, and in relation to this session, I wear two hats that I think are relevant. I'm a local government practitioner in the city of Durban in South Africa, but I'm also co-chair of the Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and hence the corporate background that you see in front of you today. Our conversation is going to be structured across 3 panels, each of which will be followed by a short Q&A session, and then we will have a discussant making inputs. What I will do now is just introduce the 3 chairs and our discussants before handing over to the first panel so that we can stick strictly to our time. So just looking at our first panel, we're going to be looking at conservation and biodiversity, and that's going to be led by Rob Marchant. He's Professor of Tropical Ecology at the University of York, where he leads the York Institute for Tropical Ecosystems. And perhaps not surprising to know that Rob's work focuses on the spatial and temporal dynamics of tropical ecosystems, their societal value, and challenges to their conservation. Our second panel will focus on coastal ecosystems. Robert Nichols will lead that, and he is director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research based at the University of East Anglia, and he has worked on coastal impacts and adaptation across the world for many years. Our final, but certainly not least, urban systems focused panel will be led by Mark Pelling, who's Professor of Geography at King's College London and Chair of the King's Centre for Integrated Research on Risk and Resilience. And he's worked on climate change adaptation in urban contexts for many years, mainly in the Global South. We're very privileged also to have with us today Melissa Leach, whose insightful comments I'm sure will provoke great discussion in our final Q&A session. She is director of the Institute of Development Studies and an anthropologist who has worked for many years on knowledge, power, and building pathways to sustainability and social justice, including colleagues in the STEPS Centre. Once Melissa has made her comments, we will open up the floor for a general Q&A that I will facilitate before we end the session. So without further ado, Rob, if I could hand over to you and our panel on conservation and biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and yes, very much welcome everybody. We're going to have 3 presentations, firstly from Lucy Waruingi, who's the Director from the African Conservation Centre, someone I've had the pleasure of working with over the last decade or so, and particularly Lucy and ACC do a lot of work around rangeland ecosystems and particularly how we can use environmental data, biological data to inform decision-making processes. Then we'll have Jane Hill. Jane is a theme leader for resilient ecosystems at the University of York in the Department of Biology. And she has a wealth of research experience around examining how biodiversity can be used, consequences of habitat destruction, climate change, tropical and temperate ecosystems, and particularly how those insights from her ecologically focused work can be used to develop effective policies and more resilient landscapes. And then we'll have Fausto from the Department of Environmental Biology, where he leads the laboratory in functional ecology and ecosystem services at the University of Sapienza in Rome. And particularly, Fausto will be looking at biodiversity and diversity, particularly within urban systems. And there's a nice link to a panel that will come later on. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it across to Lucy. There will be a short time for questions at the end of the 3 presentations, but really they're going to be questions of clarification, and hopefully themes will evolve that we'll be able to pick up in the more wholesome discussion at the end of the session. So Lucy, over to you, and I think the organisers will share your slides and you can direct them through the presentation you want to give, and then we'll pass across to Jane. Lucy, you may be muted. Hello. I'm certainly not on mute. Lucy may be muted. Maybe you're dealing with some technical issues. Jane, are you ready to give your presentation?
Yes, thanks, Rob. I can't see my slides at the moment.
I can see them coming up now. So we've got an opening slide that says challenges and solutions for conserving species responding to climate change.
Are they up? Sorry, I can't see them on my screen.
Yes, well, I can see them on my screen.
I can get started if that would be okay.
Yeah. It says, Jane, you need to pin Studio 7. I guess there's a...
I see. Yeah, I've done that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Great. Thanks very much, Rob. So hello everyone. I'm Jane Hill from the University of York. I'm an ecologist interested in understanding how species are responding to climate and thinking about adaptation under climate change. Can I have the next slide, please? So just thinking about what do we already know? Well, we know that many species are shifting upslope and shifting towards the poles. So we're seeing expansions and local extinctions in different parts of the species range. And we also know that there are expansion lags because of loss of habitat. So we're interested in thinking about how protected areas help in adaptation and resilience, and also thinking about connectivity. Next slide, please. So thinking about UK examples and about the effectiveness of protected areas, well, we do know that protected areas are in the right place for supporting range expansion, and species that are expanding their range are much more likely to colonise protected areas in the UK than the wider landscape, and they also slow up extinctions of species at their trailing edge ranges that are getting too warm. Next slide, please. So if we just shift across to Borneo for a moment and think about protected areas there, then we know that actually in many cases the protected areas are too isolated to be reached by species. So those blue blobs there are the central forest spine, and they're cool refuges, but they're hard to reach from the lowland protected areas by species that are having to traverse agricultural landscapes such as oil palm. Next slide, please. So given that agricultural areas are often barriers to range expansion and are preventing species from adapting and responding to climate change, we're thinking about how to boost connectivity and wondering about whether conservation set-asides can help. So an example from the UK about whether or not these set-asides can help. The next slide, please. The quick answer is yes, they do. They do help connectivity, even though they're quite small areas of land. They're just grassy field margins. But the issue here is that actually they don't help those species that probably need connectivity the most. So connectivity is improved, but only for a very select group of species in our computer models. Next slide, please. And these results are confirmed by similar modelling exercises looking at conservation set-asides on Borneo. And this time it's about small patches of forest within these oil palm landscapes. And again, they do benefit connectivity, but only for a certain type of species. And those species that are highly dispersive don't bother about connectivity, they're not hampered by it. But those species that probably are most in need of conservation, the very low dispersive ones, don't benefit from connectivity. So a bit of a mixed message. But the important point from this work is that if the habitat quality of those patches can be enhanced, then they provide much better support for connectivity. Next slide, please. So just to sort of pull all of this together and think about the sort of questions that we might want to ask in this panel and as part of these discussions. So the key points is that species are responding to climate change by shifting their ranges. So adaptation is about how to support those range shifts and enable species to move across inhospitable climates. Inhospitable landscapes to improve adaptation and resilience. So we've been thinking a bit in previous sessions about restoration of habitats for carbon and also for biodiversity. And I think it's an interesting question about whether there are win-wins so that these restoration projects also boost connectivity as well. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Really useful insights and around quality and connectivity at a landscape scale. I see Lucy has managed to work through the technical issues with the studio. So over to you, Lucy, and to take us into some examples from East Africa. Wonderful. I can see your first slide. So if you just ask for the studio to progress your slides as you go through the three.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And sorry, everyone, my system hung, but I'm back. Lucy Waruingi from the African Conservation Center. And to get straight into the thoughts coming from the East Africa region is to really look at how biodiversity and wildlife management does support building resilient rangelands and can provide adaptation strategies for local communities. Next. So some of the facts on our rangelands that may be known to most of you is that our rangelands are home to most biodiversity, and in fact, most of our protected areas of high biodiversity are in these rangelands, which also support a high number of our pastoral communities and are also very important habitats for the livestock economy in addition to wildlife. Next. And what we've been focusing on is using conservation strategies to enhance the ability of the rangelands to be more resilient and enable communities to adapt to the harsh climate, but also to adapt measures that improve on the productivity of the rangelands. And I'll just share 3 result areas. One being that we have been able to use the mapping and the registering of biodiversity information to determine an ecosystem-wide management plan, if looking at southern Kenya, and using that to frame the areas that are important not only for conservation, but also for restoration as an adaptive mechanism to changing climate. Next. We have also, in addition to developing ecosystem-wide management plans for biodiversity conservation, we also in that ecosystem have identified restoration across different habitats as a viable option for improving the productivity of the rangelands, and that productivity enhances the availability of forage both for wildlife and for livestock, and it also enables us to improve the grass quality, improve the soil quality, and improve the milk yields of the livestock that the communities are keeping in these rangelands. Next. Next, please. I'm not sure it's able to proceed to the next slide, but one of the outcomes of the third outcome of the work that we have been establishing is to also enable monitoring to be a tool that informs decision making. So that by monitoring, one, the quality of the habitat that's being restored, how well is wildlife able to use that restored space? But number 2, monitoring the output of this restored rangeland to the productivity of livestock. And we are measuring the grazing pressure in the restored areas and using control plots outside the restored areas. But we are also measuring the productivity of the milk yields from the livestock that the communities keep in these restored areas. And using the youth and the younger people in that setup to provide graphic illustrative results that communicate well to the local community. Next. And so I'd like to close out with some of the challenges that would enable us to improve on the quality of this sort of biodiversity, rangeland restoration and livelihood nexus, and would enable us to have greater value proposition, not only for conservation, but also for local livelihoods. And that revolves around scalability, being able to scale up these projects beyond the pilot level that we have worked with, being able to use the biodiversity and ecosystem management plans to improve mobility, because the extent to which the herds are and the livestock and wildlife are able to move around the landscape, the more effective the landscape is utilized in a productive manner. To also look at the other opportunities around carbon storage, opportunities around local interventions for livelihood enterprises, but also to look at other opportunities around carbon sequestration, around soil carbon, around grassland carbon, and use this as ways of providing incentives beyond conservation for the securing of important rangelands, both for livestock, for wildlife, and for local livelihoods. So these, I hope, would form some of the conversations we can have this afternoon on how do we scale up so that there is a value proposition that is significant in adding value to conservation and to local livelihoods. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Lucy. It's really important issues there around connections into ecosystem services, carbon, regulatory services, and links to biodiversity and scaling issues, of course. Okay, I'd like to pass across straight to our third speaker of the session, Fausto, who will talk a little bit about some of the biodiversity issues from an urban context. Fausto, over to you and your presentation.
Thank you very much. Good evening. First of all, next, please. First of all, I would like to remind soil-plant atmosphere relationships and interaction with atmospheric pollutants. As you can see, in addition to the functional process of plants, photosynthesis, transpiration, tree species can remove high pollutants from the atmosphere. Cross-section of leaf on the right of the slide show you the absorption of ozone at gaseous pollutants through the stomatal opening and the adsorption on the surface of the leaves of particulate matter. Next, please. A view of Rome's green infrastructures. Next, please. Next, please. Show you benefits that the population gains directly or indirectly from the ecosystem functions, such as removal of high pollutants, local climate mitigation, with benefits for mental, physical health and well-being, and also with reduction of hospital admissions. Next, please. Next, please, for time. Thank you. We have analyzed the removal of PM by urban forests. On the left of the slide, you can see the land use and land cover map of the Municipality of Rome, which has been obtained from Sentinel-2 data, remote sensing data. And the different vegetation types were grouped. We have been grouped in three main functional types. As you can see, conifers, evergreen, broadleaves, deciduous, broadleaves. Next, please. The figures show that broadleaf evergreen species exhibit a greater efficiency to remove particulate with a limited interannual variability. Conversely, deciduous species show a higher interannual variability within a higher abutment level than evergreen broadleaves under condition of good water availability as during summer fall 2004. And next, please, we can underline that this data highlight the need to preserve biodiversity in urban areas, as pointed out by the European Strategy to 2030. It is necessary to increase urban and peri-urban forests through the enhancement of green infrastructure network, The ecosystem services provided by urban green improve the environmental quality and well-being of the citizens. And finally, in Mediterranean areas, climate change is likely to influence functional processes of urban and peri-urban vegetation, as well as the provision of ecosystem services and quality of life. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Fausto. I see, as I mentioned, we had just a little bit of time for clarification questions. And certainly on my view, I've got no questions of clarification which come in, which is really good and allows us to keep to time. Just to really sum up, I mean, I think we had just from the three presentations from Lucy, Jane and Fausto some really nice insights from around the world, from Borneo, from the UK, from Italy, urban systems, from Kenya, on the issues around landscape connectivity and connections certainly into the wider sort of, I guess, the ecosystem service, the nature-based solutions that we get from our ecosystems. Clearly, it's going to be a big year for biodiversity and ecosystems with the parallel COP on the Convention of Biological Diversity in Kunming later in the year. And certainly those links between our ecosystems and how we can use those to deal with some of the climate change adaptation issues, I'm sure are themes we will pick up in the more general discussion later on. So please do bring your questions through. And without further ado, I'll thank our three presentations and pass across to Robert Nichols, who will take us to the world of coastal ecosystems. Over to you, Robert.
Hello. Well, thank you, Rob. And so now we're going to look at coastal systems, and I think a different setting. And we have the issue of there are many aspects of climate change in thinking about coastal systems, but sea level rise is a pervasive, an underlying trend that really is quite influential in these systems. So we have three distinguished sort of panelists here who are going to talk through different aspects of adaptation in coastal areas. Jochen Hinkel is based at the Global Climate Forum and Humboldt University in Berlin in Germany. And he was a lead author on the IPCC special report on oceans and cryosphere, which looked at the coasts. Then we'll have Marjolijn Haasnoot, who's based at Deltaris and Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And she's been working for many years on adaptation pathways and particularly their application to coastal settings. And lastly, we have Ian Townend, who's based at the University of Southampton. And Ian has a long experience working in consultancy on coastal issues and was actually one of the instigators of shoreline management planning in the UK, which is now a standard approach. And he's continued his interests in coastal policy and has been working recently on how you operationalize coastal resilience. So we'll now hear from them all in turn. So Jochen, you're first, please.
Yes, good afternoon. Next slide, please. So this is these are the IPCC sea level rise projections from the last report that Robert just mentioned. As you see, in 2050, we expect 20 to 30 centimeters, no matter which scenario. But in 2100, we can expect between 30 centimeters under a Paris goal scenario, which is the blue one here roughly. And if we don't mitigate, we can end up as much as with 1.10 meters of sea level rise. What are the consequences of this? Next slide, please. In order to understand the consequences of sea level rise, we have to think about adaptation. There are many different adaptation options available, such as dikes, putting houses on stilts, or raising the ground, or building actually entirely new islands, as you see here with an example of the Maldives. All of those options are practiced widely throughout the world and have been practiced since a long time. Under 30 centimeters of sea level rise, this is actually going to be a small problem for most parts of the world. However, it's going to be a big problem for some regions, in particular small island states and low-lying deltas. The problem is manageable. However, it's going to cost a lot of money. And the question is, can, in particular, the rural and the poor places afford that? Under 1.10 meters of sea level rise, so this is the upper end of the IPCC projections under the no mitigation scenario, this is actually going to be an existential threat to many places, in particular the small islands and the river deltas. It is an existential threat, not so much because there are no options available. Moreover, it is because places cannot afford to adapt to such high sea level rises. But it's also important to note that still this sea level rise is manageable for most parts of the world, in particular the urban places where 90% of the coastal population lives. For those places, it is actually highly efficient, so it's cheap to adapt to sea level rise because of the massive amount of capital concentrated in cities. Next slide. However, sea level rise continues beyond 2100. If we follow the Paris Agreement, then we'll likely end up with sea level rise below 1 meter in 2300. And the same holds true that I have just discussed for the 21st century in the slide before. However, if we do not mitigate, we could end up with meters of sea level rise, 3 to 5 meters according to our last IPCC report. And it's also important to note that this only represents a 66% chance of staying within that range. So sea level rise could be much higher, up to, well, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 meters in 2100, depending on the kind of height scenarios you look at. So in conclusion, there are two things to say. First, we need to mitigate in order to avoid the possibility of a catastrophic world with several meters of sea level rise, where it's very hard to imagine how we can adapt to that. Second, in any case, we need to adapt. No matter how much we mitigate, we will be confronted with coastal adaptation around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jochen. So now if we can move to Marjolijn, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, Jochen already explained that although we know sea levels will continue to rise, there is still uncertainty about the rate of sea level rise and about socioeconomic changes in the future. And this can complicate decision making. And to adapt most effectively, coastal adaptation will need to follow a series of steps, and the approach of adaptation pathways planning could support this. It could help to break adaptation into manageable steps over time, which can then accelerate adaptation and allows for learning. So in the next slide, it shows a pathways map with different routes to adapt to changing conditions. And as sea level rises, a measure may fail to reach its objectives, and additional measures are then needed. And exploring alternative sequences of decisions and evaluating them on their cost and benefits can help to identify what could be near-term, low-regret actions to make the necessary preparations, and what could be long-term options to adapt if necessary. And such a pathways map can also highlight what could be potential limits from a financial, technical point of view, possibly also available time, and also the lack of space in highly urbanizing regions. So it shows potential limits, but also path dependencies of decisions that could result in a lock-in due to urbanization, for example. So as shown in the next slide, there is a systematic approach to pathways planning, which starts with identifying the risk, the objective, but also the uncertainties and the long-term adaptation needs, also beyond 2100. And then the next step is to map the solution space. What are the options, but also what are their limits and potential thresholds, and also opportunities, for example, through required maintenance or end of lifetime of infrastructure. And then the next step is to evaluate pathways and seek for opportunities to align them with other goals like socioeconomic development and climate mitigation. And based on an evaluation of these pathways, an adaptive plan can be designed, which consists of short-term actions to make the necessary preparations and the long-term options. And monitoring is then needed to evaluate the progress and effectiveness of implementation and to detect signals of change. For example, if sea level rises faster, or to detect if opportunities may arise. And then in the next slide, you see again the projections that Jochen already showed. And here I would like to show that if sea level rises faster, the lifetime of a measure can be significantly reduced. So for example, a sea level rise measure to 0.5 meter of sea level rise could be reduced from 120 years to about 65 years. And such measures exist already today. They are huge, like the Thames Barrier or the Delta Works in the Netherlands, and they were intended to last for 100 or 200 years. So if sea level rises faster, adaptation would either need to occur at an increasing frequency or to higher amounts of sea level rise, as shown in the dashed lines. In particular, if sea level rises outside the likely range that Jochen already explained. And this can be challenging for decisions with a long lifetime, like coastal defenses, or for decisions that can take decades to prepare and implement in an orderly way, like managed retreat. So time may become a limit there. And this example again illustrates again the importance of exploring adaptation pathways, alternative routes to adapt to also different futures, and also the importance of mitigating climate change and sea level rise. And by breaking adaptation into manageable steps, different sequences, this can help to accelerate adaptation and limit the regret of investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marjolijn. So now, Ian, please.
Hello. I would like to summarise one approach that we've recently piloted in the UK. The previous speakers have outlined that there is a need to adapt and that adaptation pathways provide a useful means of planning a way forward. This has led to the advocacy of resilience as an extension of risk management. However, for this concept to be useful, it's necessary to quantify resilience in much the same way as we quantify risk. So as part of the UK Climate Resilience Programme, we examined how an operational interpretation of resilience might be applied to the coast, building on existing approaches to management. First slide, please. We set an overarching aim of enhancing coastal resilience. We then identified objectives and policy options that would support delivery of this aim. In this context, the policy options provide the mechanism to implement adaptation pathways and transitions. Importantly, maximising or minimising these contributions necessarily reflects the social, economic and environmental dimensions of resilience. Next slide. Changes and interventions can be assessed in terms of how they affect the state of resilience, while some aspects of this characterisation can be measured directly, for example, annual damages, whilst other aspects, such as community awareness, require the use of surrogate measures. The performance measures are combined into a single metric, in our case, a resilience index. This requires two steps. First, the performance measures are converted to a common scale to give a set of scores. Then the scores are adjusted by a set of weightings to reflect their relative importance. We use the weightings to capture different stakeholder perspectives. As shown on the slide, different stakeholders assign different weightings, and these combine to give different measures of resilience. Next slide, please. Combining these components, the data for the present day can be used to map the existing state of resilience. As the process of combining the measures involves applying the stakeholder weightings, the resultant maps reveal different perspectives. This is illustrated on a slide for stakeholders who weight in favour of social, economic or environmental issues. Next slide. These can be combined in many ways and offer the potential to explore different resource allocation models. Next slide. This, of course, just provides a snapshot in time. What we are really interested in is how the current state of resilience may change because of changing conditions and any interventions that are made. Next slide. This requires projections or scenarios to define future climate, demographics, land use and so on, and similarly adaptation options that may combine in. This results in changes in the performance measures over time. Next slide. These changes combine to give a measure of how resilience may change over time, as shown in the graph, and how this varies in space and time, as illustrated by the future resilience maps. In summary, for practitioners to adopt concepts such as resilience, they need practical tools that enable them to identify policy options and adaptation pathways that will help rather than hinder progress towards the intended goal. The approach I have outlined looks promising, but still needs some further development. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all three speakers, I think, for a very nice set of talks. I think when we think about the comparing this with the work on ecosystems in the previous panel, we're talking here much more about the sort of urban centres and coastal cities and developed areas of the coast as a focus, as was made the point about that in city areas, it was argued that it's very economical to think about protection approaches. So in terms of questions, we don't have any questions. So I propose that we then simply move on now to the panel chaired by Mark Pelling. So Mark, over to you, please.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks very much for the panelists in the preceding sessions. We have 4 panelists in this session, which focuses on urban systems and adaptation in urban systems. And I think leading off from Robert's comments about cities as physical places with high asset value, very quickly, I hope that we'll also extend a view that cities are places of people with all sorts of diverse skills and risks, and that it's people that are the asset of cities as much as the built fabric. So let me just outline the session by introducing the 4 speakers, and then we'll go straight into the first of those presentations. Each speaker will, like the sessions we've just heard, speak for about 3 minutes, and then we might have time for a quick question and answer before I hand over to the moderator. So the first presentation will be by Jane Weru, and Jane is Executive Director of the Akiba Mashinani Trust, which is a non-profit organisation working on developing innovative community-led solutions to housing and land tenure problems for the urban poor in Kenya. Stefan Hallegatte will then speak, and Stefan is a lead economist with the Climate Change Group in the World Bank. Mario Losasso will then follow up, and he is working in the Department of Architecture at the University of Naples. And we will round off with Maurizio Tira, who is the Rector of the University of Brescia, and also from the Department of Civil Engineering, Architecture, Land, Environment and Mathematics. So let me hand over now to Jane for the first of our key statements. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you very much, Mark. I will speak about how communities use research to identify priorities. And I'll just give you a very short example. We worked with a community in Nairobi that was faced with the threat of eviction. So every day homes were being demolished, and they did not know who was carrying out the evictions. And so they decided to conduct quick community research, and they went around and managed to get information on titles that were held by different people within the community. They studied these titles, and they were able to establish that they were able to establish whom the owners of the land were, and that they held these titles on long-term leaseholds. Using this information, they managed to file a case in court and to get an injunction. However, they realized that an injunction wasn't good enough because it did not resolve their many problems. Amongst them were the problems of flooding, problems of access to water and sanitation. So they went again and decided to carry out further research. They mapped everything in their settlement. They mapped every tap, every structure, and identified that they were actually sitting on 600 acres of private land, and that there were 100,000 households on this land that were faced with the threat of eviction with hardly any services, and that this 100,000 households were only served by 3,000 pit latrines. So the conditions were very dire. Using this information, they managed to negotiate with the county government of Nairobi to plan the area and to begin to provide services. So this is an example how research can be used by communities to identify priorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that powerful statement. I'll hand over now to Stefan.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for the invitation and the opportunity. What I wanted to say really follows up on what was just said, and the fact that, yes, we want resilience, but people's situations are very different across countries, across cities, and in cities, even across neighborhoods. And the challenge is really to build resilience while considering this diversity. Can you hear me well? So the challenge we have is to introduce resilience measures that can take into account what people want and what priorities people have for their own life. So for instance, we wouldn't want a resilience-driven policy to prevent people from moving to cities and capturing the opportunities that they can find there. And the fact that situations are so diverse means that there is no accepted outcome metrics for resilience. There is no one single resilience indicator that we can use to guide action. We really need to be context specific. So what we have been trying to do at the World Bank is to create a resilience rating system which tries not to tell decision makers or investors or policymakers what is the right level of resilience, because that's their choice, but to make sure the decision makers, people deciding about measures and policies, have the right information. So we put a rating on projects. It can be a C if it's not so good, and it goes to A+ if it's really great. And basically, the higher your rating, the better risks and climate change risks have been considered in the design of the project, and the better the information given to decision makers is about climate risk. So what we rate is the quality of the information that we give decision makers or communities to make the right decision. And so it's all about processes. Have you looked at risks? Did you include the risk in the economic analysis? Did you include the risk in the design of the project? Without trying to tell people this risk is acceptable and this risk is not acceptable, because we feel that decision is best made by local people and decision makers. The other dimension we're trying to look is whether projects are contributing to the resilience of the population, what we call the resilience through the project outcomes. And so we have another rating for that, because those two dimensions, of course, are different. And here it's a little bit of the same thing. We have a rating going from C to A+, and basically the more your project is transformational and help the population deal with risks, the higher your rating. And what we're trying to do with this rating is to make it possible for a decision maker who might not be an expert on climate change, might not want to read 200 pages of technical annexes to know if risks have been well introduced in product design, to inform this decision maker about whether she or he can trust that the project will deliver what it should. And instead of having to go through this very detailed description of the project, we provide one letter that can make that decision easier, especially for non-experts. So this is a tool that we have published the methodology recently, and we're calling for feedback and comments, and we're piloting it in 20 projects in low-income countries at the moment to see how it works and how it can be applied. And the goal is that really we can combine resilience with due consideration of people's own objectives and own value and own risk appetite and risk tolerance, so that we can really have a tailored approach to resilience. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stefan. No lack of ambition in what you described there. Really exciting work. Let me hand over now to Mario Losasso. Mario.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I speak about the adaptation in urban areas, and I have a small speech with 4 focuses. The first is not only strategies but actions for the evolving concept of climate adaptation in urban areas. We know that in last years the concept of climate adaptation has shifted from the prevailing strategies and pilot level towards a system of sectoral actions covering protection and of the natural and anthropic systems. The second concept, the second focus, is that cities are at the core of adaptation policies and actions, because cities are the most important point in which people lives in our planet. Urban districts can be considered the appropriate dimensional framework for adaptive design in the prevention and reduction of effects due to climate impacts. Redevelopment of urban districts is necessary to reduce the climate vulnerability of cities, and it is necessary a gradual conversion of existing urban districts into less vulnerable and resilient eco-districts. The third focus is measuring adaptation as reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience in urban areas. It is important to evaluate the progress of planned actions and check the outcomes referred to goals that were set up when developing the strategies. It's important to consider, if necessary, to adjust, add, or drop certain actions in view of the monitoring results. Important elements of monitoring and evaluation processes are the approach of framework, selection of suitable indicators, protocols, and the process to use the results of the evaluation to improve a local authority's actions for the future. This is important because national adaptation monitoring not yet capture local level. Finally, there is an importance of adaptation co-benefits and integration with mitigation measures. In fact, we know that adaptation options also involve emission mitigation, can create synergies and cost saving in most sectors and the system transitions, such as when low carbon buildings are also designed also for efficient cooling. Conflicts between mitigation and adaptation can even reduce ecosystem functions and services and other aspects of sustainable development. So it is important to connect adaptation with mitigation goals. Finally, a combination of adaptation and mitigation options can limit global warming implemented in a participatory and integrated manner, and can ensure rapid and systemic, we hope, transition in urban areas. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mario. I particularly pick up the point you make on adaptation monitoring, not necessarily capturing the local level, which I think echoes some of the earlier points as well. We might return to that later. So the last presentation then is by Maurizio Tira. So Maurizio, the floor is yours. Maurizio, you may be muted.
Now?
Yes. Please go ahead.
So the land use planning has been traditionally seen as a way of economic needs and secure space, trying to combine in the best way. The land value captured by the private transformation was mainly meant to realize public services and urban infrastructure. Problems caused by climate changes to urban infrastructure now need extra money to be invested together with the need to reduce fuel consumption. Oh, can't you hear me?
Maurizio, we're finding it difficult to hear. The volume is very low. Are you able to speak a little closer to the microphone?
Very sorry.
Oh, that's perfect. Yes, thank you.
It's okay now?
Now it's quiet again.
Oh my God.
We can hear you. People will turn up their volume, I'm sure. If you go ahead and speak close.
What about now? Is it better now?
That's much better, yes. Now though, we seem to have lost your sound completely.
What about now?
Yeah, that's good.
Well, my point is that the problem caused by climate change now need extra money to be invested together with need to reduce fuel consumption. So since the money comes qualities from the transformation of lands, then we need now to reduce it, and at the same time we need money to maintain urban infrastructure. It is a paradoxical situation. So I don't know how to manage it. I can try to enter again. That's the only possibility I have.
I carry on. I think people can hear you. It's faint, but people will turn the volumes up. That's fine.
I'm really sorry.
No problem.
Well, again, the point that I'm raising is how can we get resources to maintain urban infrastructure together with the need of reducing the grid fuel consumption. The directive of the European Commission 2001, number 42, introduced the strategic environmental assessment. And I think this is the measure we have to implement to measure ex ante, so before the transformation happens, the resources we need to charge the private transformation for the necessary resources to face the problem created by climate changes. the experiences now of the assessment still quite poor, at least in my country. And the paradox again is that the minor communities with less resources are facing the biggest problems because they don't afford to reduce the impact of climate changes. I think we have to move in three directions. One is developing a comprehensive index to measure the contribute given by the transformation to the local authorities by measuring the global positive impacts of the transformation, for example, retrofitting buildings. The second point is stressing and incentivizing the building renovation through also fiscal incentives. We know an average of 3% of annually renovation to accomplish the union targets. And the third point is stressing better the strong relation between mobility and urban planning so that the urban organisms are organized so that people need less transportation infrastructure to move and more mix of urban uses. These three are just three challenges we planners, I think, we are facing to design new urban development and renovation to reduce both the impact of climate changes and to try to realize communities that can adapt to the climate changes by funding their resources without consuming too much new green fields. I apologize for making you lose time for my audio. Sorry.
Thank you, Maurizio. And no problem. We had inherited a couple of minutes from the earlier session, so in fact we still have some time. I'd encourage those who are watching to please enter questions into the interface, and we can pick those up either now or in the general discussion. They really are important for powering this session. We have, I think, 3 or 4 minutes, and I'd use that time to ask perhaps a single question to the panel. It might be challenging, but I'd be very interested in all of your answers. You've discussed in one way or another indexing, monitoring, measuring vulnerability, or looking at the feasibility of different adaptation options. I heard less about the impacts of adaptation actions on society or the environment. I wonder if you have any experience or views on how successful we are as a research community in measuring the impacts of adaptation, perhaps how far the adaptation actions have succeeded in meeting their aims, or how far they've contributed to wider challenges of development, the co-benefits of mitigation, for example, that Mario mentioned. So I'll open the floor in case any of you have a direct response to that, and if not, I might call some people to respond. But who'd like to go first?
Yes, we have few seconds. I can remember that, for example, in Berlin, there are 14 indicators, 43 impact indicators, and 47 response indicators as the basis to evaluate the success of adaptation strategies, as verification and spatial specification on climate projections, and also as an indication of trends that are not yet captured by climate models that are general models. So we need a speed process of downscaling and upscaling in planning and in environmental design.
Thank you. That downscaling, upscaling is important. And any last comments from anybody on this question?
Yeah, I think this is Stefan. I think you ask a great question, and I don't think we're doing a great job at measuring the benefits from adaptation and resilience. I think we have two problems that we don't really know how to solve. One is when we try to measure the results in terms of actual outcomes, they are mostly driven by luck. So you might invest in everything that you need and you still get one of those big disasters and you're overwhelmed and you have damages, even though you have done the right thing. And sometimes people are just completely ignoring risks and just happen to be lucky and nothing too bad happens. So I think we cannot look only at outcomes. We can't avoid some sort of modeling work to assess the results, and observing outcomes is not enough. And the second point is that we're missing a lot of the development gains. One example in Vietnam, in a city with floods occurring every year or every 2 years, of course, you don't have a lot of development there. And when we protect that area against floods, we look at avoided losses. And avoided losses are very small because neighborhoods are not developed. But when you protect the area, you provide infrastructure, then you get the investment, then you get people to improve their housing, and you have a development gain that you don't capture with avoided losses. So these dynamics of how adaptation and resilience helps with development and poverty reduction is something that we're still disregarding and ignoring in many cases, and this is really an area for research.
Thank you. And I mean, I think one can include social policy measures as well, social safety nets and so on, that can extend that challenge even a little further. I'm sure others also wanted to come in, but I should probably end this session at this point. Thanks very much to the speakers, and hopefully you'll be able to stay for the broader Q&A. And at this point, I'll hand over to Melissa Leach, the discussant, for some thoughts to kickstart our broader discussion.
Okay.
Melissa.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, contributors. That was a really fascinating set of presentations. And in the few minutes I've got, I just wanted to draw out just a few cross-cutting themes, and they're things I heard or that were implied. There are also some things I didn't hear as much as I might have expected to hear and that we might want to discuss. But one of the bigger things that certainly struck me was that a lot of the context and the presentations were very different, and it really, I think, emphasises how many opportunities there are for cross-learning between these very different examples, geographically, socially, ecologically, across the rural and the urban and land and sea. So I've got sort of three themes I wanted to address briefly. The first is a sort of cluster of what one might call conceptual connections around what we really mean when we talk about adaptation or resilience, or indeed some other words that have come up, pathways and transformation. And I think we heard from these presentations that robust adaptation is vital, but it can't just be to calculable individual risks. Climate change, as we know, in complex social ecological systems is associated with some far more fundamental uncertainties and unknowns, where we can't calculate the probabilities amongst outcomes in the way that you can with a risk, or where perhaps surprises are in store. And we're also looking at bundles of intersecting and uncertain effects across scales. That's a complex set of situations, and I think it underlines the need for resilience in its broadest sense. But again, this is resilience not just in some of the conventional ways it's been thought about as kind of bouncing back from a shock to bring one back to a status quo. But I heard in some of these presentations the ambition for something much more transformative, perhaps transformative resilience, where we're thinking about capacities to respond to disruptions in ways that actually propel landscapes, ecologies, coast societies forwards towards a better future, a more thriving future, something we might call charting pathways to greater sustainability. That's the way colleagues and I often in the STEP Centre have put it. And I think we also heard from a couple of presentations that we need to recognise plural possible pathways, because one size isn't going to fit all, and because in a situation of uncertainty you may need to change course as you go and as things change. So I think the presentations showed us some really exciting examples. They showed us how this sense of resilience, transformative resilience, can to some extent be designed in to the way we do landscapes, conservation, coastal or urban system planning. think they showed us how planning itself may need to be stepwise and adaptive. I think the way Marjolijn Haasnoot put it so clearly, the idea of adaptive pathways planning for sea level rise. But I think what we also heard, and maybe I'd have liked to hear a little bit more about it, is that transformative resilience might also need some more fundamental shifts in institutions, in incentives, in practices, and their underlying structures and politics. Because we can't just assume that a good adaptive pathway is going to unfold. It might involve challenging and maybe resetting the power-laden directions of development, of coastal exploitation, of urban development and so on, that are currently working against adaptation or blocking pathways, something I think we presentation of all. So my second sort of question or theme is really a question where I would want to ask adaptation or resilience of what and for whom? Are we talking about the priority being the resilience of non-human species and biodiversity and ecosystems? That was actually the focus that some of the biodiversity presentations took, just at an immediate sense. Or of people and social and economic systems and livelihoods? Or I think what we're usually talking about at root is these more complicated multi-species social ecological entanglements on which we know that both human and ecosystem thriving is dependent. There's a real mutuality there. And perhaps that's what we need to be thinking about in terms of resilience and adaptation. And yet, as soon as we factor in the social and people, we need to recognise just as the impacts of climate change itself are going to be felt very differently by different people and groups, whether by class, poverty and wealth, by gender, maybe by ethnicity, by occupation, by place, or the intersections of all those things, so too are capacities to adapt and be resilient, and also what matters in that resilience. And as several of our presenters kind of pointed out, if we're looking at a more resilient coastal system that actually in the process wipes out the livelihoods of certain fishing communities, perhaps, or if we're looking at enhanced biodiversity and conservation, ecosystem resilience that ends up excluding women gatherers and farmers from vital resource access, or if we're looking at urban risk management and resilience that actually takes people out of the picture and excludes vital urban opportunities, we can end up with a situation that's unjust at best, often ineffective in terms of resilience, and at its worst examples of what I've sometimes called in my work green grabbing, but maybe here we're talking about resilience grabbing. So I think we need actually to attend, as some presenters did, but maybe all of them could have a little bit further, the equity and justice implications of our adaptation pathways. And we can think of that in several ways. We can think of it around perhaps a particular intervention or a pathway. We can think of equity as recognitional in the sense of who's in as a stakeholder, who do we think about? There's a procedural element, who participates and how, who has influence over the decisions. And then there's a distributional element in the sense of the distribution of the impacts or the outcomes of adaptations, that point that Mark raised right at the end of the session, who gains and who loses. And all of those elements of equity, I think, underline the need for perhaps an inclusive and sometimes deliberative process of scheme design. And indeed, again, challenging some of the structures that work against that participation. To pick up on Jane Weru's example, for instance, how do we bring people in to a situation where we're trying to overcome low sanitation in Kenya and involve low-income settlement residents in planning? So finally, that brings me to my third theme, and I thought, given that this is part of a university's conference, it's worth just saying something about research. What are the roles for research in building effective adaptation and resilience pathways, and of what kinds? And I think we saw in these presentations some brilliant examples of research helpful in identifying pathways to resilience, supporting them in their unfolding, and also monitoring and evaluating progress and outcomes. I think we also saw some key values and approaches which were reflected to different degrees in the talks. One is around interdisciplinarity, we've got people who presented from different disciplines, but I think some of the best examples came from where we integrated ecological and social sciences, often bringing in other disciplines, technical disciplines like engineering or urban planning. I think we also saw some nice examples of methodological innovation and creativity, whether in digital tech and modelling, or participation, shown so nicely by Jane Weru in Kenya, or combinations of quant and qual measures. And then I think finally, and perhaps most importantly, we saw some really nice examples of transdisciplinarity, the co-production, where academics are getting together with policymakers, practitioners, community members, both in setting the questions, collecting and analysing data, and acting on results. And I think ultimately it's this kind of combination of multiple kinds and scales of knowledge and expertise, including the very local and the experiential, in a way bringing in the people on the ground at the sharp end of climate change and its needs for adaptation, building on their own practices often, but also the national and global, so that we can begin to see that bigger picture and those patterns and draw out the implications. So those are just some of the things I take away, and some of the areas where I think presentations and the themes we've looked at might learn from each other. But I look forward very, very much to taking forward these and some of the other questions that no doubt people have as we move into the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, very much, Melissa, for those very, very thoughtful comments. What we have before us now is approximately 20 minutes where we can debate across this full range of issues that Melissa has so competently pinpointed and summarized for us. And to kickstart it, we've got a question from Dr. Sarada Prasad, who's really picked up the challenge that Melissa indicated of looking to the synergies and co-benefits. And the question here is, can ecosystem services, which many of our panelists have pointed out, as adaptation to climate change, be used to eradicate poverty worldwide? And I wonder if I couldn't call on Lucy potentially, who opened up our panel, to reflect on that question. So the link is, can our use of ecosystem services as adaptation to climate change perhaps be used as a mechanism to eradicate poverty worldwide? Lucy. I'm not. Is Lucy still online? Perhaps if Lucy's having problems, I could ask other members of the first panel, or indeed across the panels, to reflect on that question. Perhaps Rob, you might want to start as the convener.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think Lucy mentioned it a few times, and we heard it in some of the other presentations as well, about that sort of link into sort of ecosystem services. I mean, I guess a key one is around carbon, be that blue carbon or carbon within soils or within ecosystems. And clearly there's a lot of work going on within that sort of nature-based solutions space. Particularly with the work of IPCC and all of the massive amount of work around the world about how we can work with nature. Clearly there are lots of challenges, and making sure that ecosystem service agenda doesn't allow grasslands to be ploughed up for tree planting where grasslands need to be preserved, or livelihoods are railroaded out of the way for preserving ecosystem services. So again, there's lots of challenges around that sort of broader sort of ecosystem service agenda. But I think inherently, if we are looking for those sort of multiple opportunities, and to allow equity and responses to be just and well distributed, certainly working with ecosystem function has to be one of the ways forward. And I'm sure that will be at the heart of this sort of adaptation and research alliance that is being developed this year.
Thanks so much, Rob. I see we have Lucy back, so let me redirect that question to her as well, just to offer her insights on the value of ecosystem-based adaptation as a means to alleviate poverty at a global level. Lucy.
Thank you, Deborah. And sorry again, I seem to be having challenges with keeping my teams connected. Looking at the rangelands, which is a place we have had great experience working, it has become evident that ecosystem adaptation will underpin even the rural development of the development of the rural economies in those areas, because everyone lives 90% off the land. So if the land cannot be productive, if the land cannot be resilient, you're having losses in biodiversity, you're having losses in productivity of the range for livestock and for agriculture, which is subsistent. You're having limitations in options of what can be done on that landscape. So enabling adaptation that builds in the resilience back to the system and enables it to resist the shocks that will come to it through the change in climate is going to be critical. So not just because it's important for biodiversity, but it's actually going to be critical for sustaining livelihoods in these semi-arid areas that really benefit more by the mobility that's enabled. The low marginal rainfall requires that you must have high productivity when you get the rainfall. And as long as degradation is not in check, then we will not be able to find the stability both for people and for the environment.
Thanks, Lucy. And I think those answers are incredibly important because what they re-emphasize with us is that as part of the transformation that Melissa called out for us, a very strong reflection we need to have as a society about our relationship with the planet, which fundamentally underpins our development needs. And so there is a conceptual need to rebuild that relationship. And I think we saw that called out very strongly in the recent report by UNEP, Making Peace with Nature, which over and above summarizing the big global assessments, also called out the fact that we have to re-envision our place on the planet. And so I think the answer to that question is that re-envisaging the relationship with the planet is an inherent part of ecosystem-based adaptation, which sees ecosystems as a fundamental way of ensuring livelihoods, particularly of the poor and vulnerable. So thank you for those. Our second question also comes from Dr. Sarada Prasad, who I think in this time of COVID poses a very interesting question to us and asks whether the movements of people from rural to urban, and certainly I'm seeing that in our context as we see increasing poverty in rural areas because of the impact of the pandemic, people are beginning to move into the cities. Could this movement from rural to urban areas be a decisive point in adaptation? So perhaps I could start off by asking Stefan to reflect on how perhaps the World Bank might see this major urbanization project in hand as an opportunity to create global scale adaptation opportunities.
Thank you, Deborah. And indeed, I mean, it's a window of opportunity. That's the kind of scary part of it, because we have a few decades before basically this massive change will be completed. And once cities are created, they are created for all, right? It's very difficult to change urban forms. So we have this opportunity. At the same time, the situation is very different in different contexts and different countries. We see in some places this urbanization transformed into urban sprawl. We see some cities going up with more like bigger buildings and more space. And in Africa, especially, we see this urbanization translating into the space per person dropping. So it's really overcrowding with a lot of environmental and quality of life implications. And for me, the big challenge is we're repeating some of the same recommendations for decades, right? Implementation is really the challenge. We kind of know on paper that urban planning, developing cities around public transit, security of tenure, all of those things we know are good things to have, but the implementation is a really big challenge, and time is running out. So this is clearly for us a priority. This is something that cannot be only urban. It has to be coordinated with what's going on in the rural areas. This is really about the interface. So you can't only work on cities. And we keep in mind that people are migrating towards cities for the opportunities they offer in terms of jobs, healthcare, schooling. And this is a really big concern that whatever we're doing shouldn't prevent, especially very poor people, from capturing those opportunities. So there is no way around the hard work of building good institutions, improving governance. Takes time, no magic bullet, but this is something that just people should just invest their time and effort in, because the benefits can be enormous.
Thank you, Stefan. I wonder if I couldn't call in Jane on that question as well, just simply because, Jane, you speak to the communities who lie outside the formal governance structures. And for whom the more formalized responses may not be effective. These are people who are building cities, from the bottom up, because our existing cities don't meet their needs. And I wonder if you would see the migration from rural to urban as the same adaptation advantage. Do we have Jane? Maybe then, if Jane is not with us, I could pose that question back to Mark for some quick reflections, just from the perspective of the work that you've done in the Global South. I'm calling on you both here as chair and moderator.
Thank you. Oh, what a privilege. Well, I wouldn't dare to speak on Jane's behalf. It's rather the other way around. One is inspired by the work of Jane and her colleagues in Shack and Slum Dwellers International, certainly. But you're right, and perhaps to follow up from Stefan, this sense of increasing intensification within cities very much, I think, marks out a lot of the experience of urban poverty and risk coinciding. Of course, there's tremendous energy, great leadership, and we've seen that with COVID. Some work we've done in Nairobi, looking at the number of hand washing points, information disbursement points, food dispersal points that have sprung up from within informal settlements. So there's very much a part of the solution space. But for me, I think the opportunity comes, and Jane and her group have been part of this, when organized groups of the urban poor are able, as she said, to generate data that is respected and legitimized by urban authorities that themselves have the power to enact infrastructure planning at scale. And that's very difficult for it to happen well, of course, but there are opportunities. And I think groups like Shack and Slum Dwellers International are quite important in being able to really change the way in which the urban poor are seen and how they are engaged with by those that have a more strategic set of power in shaping the city. So the urban poor really not just having a voice and a lived experience, but actual, knowledge that can be codified in scientific ways and that can lead the discussion of what is to be adapted, what's to be enhanced, what maybe is left behind through resilience building. So thanks. I'll stop there.
Lovely, thanks, Mark. Rob, I see your hand. Would you like to come in on this point?
Well, it was just, again, picking up on what Stefan mentioned earlier on about this, the connections at scale across the landscape. And, I'm not an urbanist, but certainly, I understand those connections between the urban and the rural. I think Jane Hill was talking earlier on about connections at a landscape level in terms of migration and, things being able to move and to adapt. And I guess, that broader scale issue is, I think, one of the key challenges, I guess, going forward in how that we can, develop tools and metrics to be able to work across these quite large and very much interconnected scales. Interconnections in terms of social interconnections, but also ecological interconnections. So it was really just sort of building on from what Stefan had mentioned earlier on. That's what I see as one particularly important area and particularly important challenge ahead.
Great, thanks, Rob. And I think that ties back nicely to where we started, because what you're really emphasizing is this systemic view of how we need to tackle things, that things are not compartmentalized. I want to, in the final minutes we have, just abuse my role as chair. The majority of my life is spent as a practitioner, and while I'm delighted by models and graphs, the majority of those models and graphs do not speak to the cohort of people that I work with. And a number of you, Stefan and Ian amongst you, stress the importance of tools that were easy to use and for practitioners to understand, because these are the people who are working at the interface between all of these needs, between all of these systems, expecting that we might deploy the resources that we have to develop a more systemic approach to these challenges, to draw more people to the table. And so the question I would pose to the panelists is how, given that this is a university gathering, do we ensure that the generators of these tools, these models, for example, are better connected to the users of those models, so that that information can flow easily, it can be understandable. Any ideas on that element of the transformation, how we can expedite that link between the top down and the bottom up? Rob, I see you offering your hand to come in there. Or is it a legacy hand?
It was a thinking hand, but I'll leave it to the presenters and I'll come in.
Great. Perhaps Jochen, I mean, we've trodden the boards together, as it were, on the IPCC and looked at those very complex graphs. Could I call on you? And then I see Ian afterwards.
Yes, thanks, Deborah. I mean, half of my life is also being sort of very close to the practice of adapting to sea level rise. And so I've been translating many figures from the IPCC report to practitioners, helping them to understand. And I think a couple of insights from that is, I mean, first of all, I think we really need to start to think the whole climate issue from the point of view of the problem a person is facing in a given context, in a given place. And then you can use the modeling information and translate it towards the context and the situation the person is confronted with. And we are doing that in the context of sea level rise, and then also, well, in some context where a lot of investment needs to be made, for example, rather technical approaches are necessary, but in other contexts, we don't actually need models at all. It's sufficient to look at the figure. We've got 20 to, I don't know, 1 meter of sea level rise. Let's see what we can do. And so being responsive to the context, and I think this has been said a couple of times today by other panelists, I think this is really key.
Great, Jochen. Ian, your hand is down, but I know you had it up. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you very much, Deborah. We've just been funded to extend the work I presented to develop an online portal, and the idea of this is to actually allow stakeholders or local groups to essentially play for themselves with the concept of resilience and see what different decisions that they might choose to make, what impact that has on your resilience outcome. And obviously it's a model, it's a game really, but hopefully the idea is that it will get people familiar with the concepts and have a broader understanding of what does or potentially does not work. So that's all I wanted to just point out at this stage. Thanks.
Great. Stefan, could I ask you to come in very quickly before I sum up, because we're about to run out of time. So if you could limit your inputs to like 15 seconds, that would be brilliant. Rob, I apologize.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that we know how to connect with decision makers because we have good examples of that. And I think in most cases, it's by starting from the decision makers' objectives. And it means that the topic is rarely adaptation and resilience. The topic is energy access, housing affordability, and we have to just bring adaptation in it. And I did not make many friends in my community by saying that adaptation is not a thing, but alone, isolated, it's not very useful. It's useful only if connected with the objective that people have. So I'll stop here, but I think that's an important thing to keep in mind for this community.
Yeah. And I agree, and I think that's a wonderful way to end the session, because I think while we focused in on big systems, coastal systems, ecosystems, modeling systems, socio-political systems, a lot of our work has to start by simply inviting people to the table, ensuring the people who are at the table are representative of all groups, not only those resources, but those who are vulnerable and generally excluded from society, and really talking development first. I think this is a world in which our adaptation action, the division between adaptation and development, is an artificial one in the real world. And so part of our systemic approach is not only about reforming a new relationship with our planet, but between ourselves, those who have, those who do not have, and working together to pull these multiple themes together through the pathways, through the stepwise approach that we've heard, constantly readjusting, because we're not going to always get it right. So we've got a complex job ahead of us if we are to robustly adapt to climate change, but I think it's been a very useful conversation to put an often neglected topic right in the middle of the preparations before COP26. Adaptation has been neglected for a long time, and I'm delighted to see the academic community rallying to help prioritize before Glasgow. So I think our time is up, and with that I'd like to thank all of our panelists, our chairs, Melissa for her insightful comments, our organizers, and for those of you who attended the session and the very interesting questions. Thank you one and all.